For those of you who don't know anything about Bedford Creative Arts, we are an arts charity based in Bedford. We've been running for nearly 40 years, and we're a socially engaged charity that commissions artists to work with communities in all art forms, in all sorts of different projects. So we address social issues like wellbeing in communities, we might look at skills development, or we might do things such as regeneration in the town centre and everything in between. We're a national portfolio organisation of Arts Council England. And for this particular project, we're working in partnership with an organisation called 1 Degree East. So the Producer Hub is a mentoring programme delivered by 1 Degree East across the East region. They're also a producing organisation. They produce their own creative projects, but they do all sorts of mentoring activity in places like Norwich, in Kent, in Luton, and now in Bedford. So we have a cohort of people who are being mentored between now and July next year. But these webinars and our Creative Exchange networking events are all free for anyone who's a creative to enjoy. So do check out our website for dates of further sessions. So this particular first one is going to be on project management. So we're going to look a little bit about what we mean by project management, how I define it, certainly, and what we're going to make sure you know in this context. As part of that, we're going to look a little bit at the difference between producing and project management. And I'm going to make a case that I think they're slightly different. And we're not going to go into the role of a producer in this. We're going to look solely at the logistical project management of projects. We're going to look a little bit at best practice and what some project management theorists say about good project management. We're going to touch a little bit on some templates and tools, but some of those you might find out from further webinars. And then I'm hoping there will be time for some questions at the end. So, what is project management? Well, there is a definition on the screen from a Prince 2 qualification. So for those of you who haven't heard of Prince 2, Prince stands for Projects in Controlled Environments, and it's a professional project management qualification. For the vast majority of you, doing a Prince 2 qualification would be like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and I don't recommend it. But I've done it, and I think if you were going to do a really big project, then you might find it useful. But what I do like about it is some of its best practice. And so their definition is really good. It covers the whole concept of project management being planning, delegating, monitoring, and control of all aspects of a project to achieve its objectives. Interestingly, it doesn't mean doing everything on the project. It means planning it and making sure the stuff gets done, but you can delegate. I appreciate some of you might be working on projects where you have to wear all of the hats and you're going to be both planning and doing as well as delegating. That's completely fine, but it's good to be aware that actually it's not necessarily the role of a project manager to do the doing. And the important thing is that they are delivering a project to achieve its objectives, whether they're making sure it's on budget, on time, the quality standard is there. It's the project manager who's responsible for doing that. But if you want a more simple definition, I would say that project planning and managing is basically identifying and then controlling what needs to be done, when it needs to be done by, and who's going to do it. So if a funder or anyone says, I need to see your project plan, you just need to give them a document in any format you like that says what needs to be done, when it's going to be done by, and who is going to do it. And then your job as a project manager is just to make sure that that actually happens. And it really is as simple as that. These are some of the principles of Prince 2. So in terms of some best practice guidance, I quite like these as things to consider. So it might be worth just going through these and thinking about whether you have ever considered them when you've been doing project management. So number one, when you're doing a project, you need to keep track of why you're doing it. I know it sounds very silly, but quite often you can forget along the way, what is this project trying to achieve? Why am I even doing it? Is it still relevant? And that's particularly true of long projects where you might work over a really extended period of time. And the reason why you thought you were doing the project at the start may not be true at the end. And you may actually think halfway through, I don't think I should be doing this project anymore. So it's really good to make sure that you do a project in stages, and at each stage of the project, you ask yourself, is there still a really good reason for doing it? Another one is learning from experience. I think we can all be quite bad at actually remembering to go back to projects you've done before and learn from your mistakes. In every project you do, you will learn things about how to do things better. you'll, experience things that went wrong or things that went really well, and you think that all of that learning goes into your head and you'll always remember it, but you don't always do that. And it's really good to find a way of actually recording what it is that you've learned from a project, and then when you're planning the next one, go back and read that again and see if you can apply that learning to your new project. Clear roles and responsibilities. This is one of the reasons why I'm going to look at the difference between producing and project management. The moment you have more than one person working on a project, you need to be very clear about who is doing what. If you cover that really well at the beginning, then things should go smoothly. Often where there's problems, particularly arguments or disagreements about things, it's because people aren't quite clear who is covering which role. And so being absolutely clear at the beginning about that means that people know to stay in their tram lines. Manage it in stages. This principle is absolutely crucial. Quite often when you start thinking about managing a project, you just try and get to the end, try and get to the outcome, the play, the exhibition, the thing at the end that you're going to deliver. The danger of doing that is if things do start to go wrong, if you do start to go off the rails a little bit, it can be really hard to claw it back. And sometimes when you get to the end, well over budget, the timescale is going to miss, and some of that could have been pulled back if you breathed at some point in the process. So one of the things I recommend is that you actually work out what the stages are of the project and do things a little bit at a time. And at each point, breathe, stop, pause before you move on to the next stage. And it allows you to just rein in anything that might be going wrong, re-clarify roles and responsibilities, look at the budget before you take the next step. It also means if the project is really going wrong, maybe you pull it at that point before you get too far down the line. It might sound drastic, but sometimes it really is okay to stop a project if it's not what it should be anymore. Delegate and leave alone. As part of this session today, we're going to look a little bit about good delegation. And the reason for that is because a good project manager is able to delegate some things and then focus on just what they need to do. If you delegate well, you should be able to leave someone to crack on and only get involved if there's a problem. You should have a system for making sure they give you progress reports, but actually otherwise, let them do what they're doing. So good delegation works really well. Again, I appreciate some of you might be working on small projects where you're having to wear all the hats, but hopefully at least occasionally, there'll be someone else on the team who you could delegate to. So we're going to look at that. It's what Prince 2 were called managing by exception. You only get involved if something exceptional happens. Tailor the approach. The other thing about everything we're going to talk about today is that you need to tailor how you project manage based on the size of the project. If your project is one workshop, you obviously don't need to do a big Gantt chart and a big budget and a big project plan. You can tailor it right down and make it the right scale. But if you're doing a play that's going to have a whole workshop program associated with it and an exhibition, and it's going to take 2 years, you're going to want to scale things up a bit, and you're probably going to want to add more detail. So have a think about how you might do that. So I'm going to argue that project management is basically from the right side of that orange line. So the planning, delivery, control, and close down of the project. I'm going to argue that it isn't the initiation stage. That, I think, is what a producer does. I think it's not this. The reason why this is important is that sometimes people run into trying to plan and deliver their project before they've actually finished thinking about what the project is. If you're still in that stage, try and get to the end of really designing the project before you start planning and delivering it. The danger is you get into the delivery stages before you've finished asking all of the questions about what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it. If you can do that first, you'll make sure that actually you could delegate things really effectively and keep control of it. My argument would be, don't get started with the planning and project management stage until you've really finished defining what the project is and it's fully designed, which is the role of a producer. So we're not going to dwell on this too much. For those of you on the cohort, you're going to cover this in your next session, that sort of project initiation phase. But these are the questions that you really want to have answered before you start writing your project plan. What actually is it? What are you going to deliver? What are the outputs, the things that you're going to produce? The more detail you can put to that, the better at the start. Why are you doing it? Is it needed? Why is it needed? Being really clear on that helps you to set really good objectives. If there isn't a need for the project, you might find that you don't get the audiences you want and you're always pushing harder than you should be to try and get it delivered. What are the project's outcomes? What is it that will be different at the end of it? And what actually is it you're going to try and achieve? The reason why you need to know this at the start is that the project manager is going to end up being responsible for measuring these and reporting on them. But it's up to the producer to work out what those things are. Who are you doing it for? This is your audience development plan. Who are the audiences? How are they going to be involved? Are they going to be involved? Answering that question, again, really helps to make decisions when you're planning about how should you market it, where should it be held, etc. The project manager is going to need to know the answers to those questions. Who are you doing it with? Who's on the team, particularly in terms of artistic talent and partners? Now, if you are the artistic talent, that may be simple, but if you're going to be working with other artists and other creatives, or working with partners who might be venues or other creatives or community organisations, being really clear again about their roles and responsibilities is something you're going to need to know before you start. When? As much as the project manager might get involved in producing a schedule and a timeline, the producer will definitely clarify at least approximately when you want it to happen before you even begin planning. And then the whole issue of cost and budget. There's another webinar where we're going to go into that in a lot more detail. But understanding how much it's going to cost, again, I would argue it's up to the producer to set that budget and the project manager to manage it. And then how is everyone going to be involved? Again, this is all about roles and responsibilities. Make that really clear at the start so the project manager knows how they're working with people. Are you going to have to consult other stakeholders such as funders? Go back to those lessons learned. And this is something that lots of people forget is once you've created something, what are you going to do with it at the end? Depends on what it is. Is it script? Are you just going to leave it on a file? But if it's visual art, quite often it's very easy to produce things and then they just end up in storage at the end of it, potentially for years, because you've not thought about what their journey is going to be at the end. So you need some kind of archive plan. I'm going to argue that all of this needs to happen before you get into the nitty-gritty of project management. At that point, if you've done all that, you can appoint the project manager, unless it's just you wearing another hat. So the whole process of project planning looks a little bit like this. I'm going to argue that the orange leans slightly more towards the role of the producer and the blue slightly more towards the role of the project manager. So the producer will drive that initiation stage. And then when it comes to the planning, of course, they're going to be involved, but then they can start delegating that to a project manager. They will then guide through the implementation stages and the implementation of the outcome and drive the debrief process that feeds back into the producer. The producer is going to be overarching over the top of all of this, but they should be able to leave the project manager to do the bulk of it. So looking a little bit at those roles side by side, I'm going to argue, and this is just my view, I have to admit, but I think that the producer designs the project with the creatives, defines those objectives and things, what the outputs are going to be. They probably lead on the commissioning of the artistic team and designing that budget, and they set all of those goals for what you're going to achieve. They're also going to think about what they think the evaluation approach should be, and will probably lead on those key relationships throughout the project. So the project manager is much more logistical. This is nuts and bolts. And you'll notice that the role of project manager is no different whether it's a creative project or any other kind of project. They manage the project management systems. How are you going to administer it? How are you going to keep track of tasks? Who is the delivery team, the people who do the doing? So they may oversee the artistic delivery, but actually it's on a much more logistical level. They're going to be creating different plans, and I'm going to argue that there's no such thing as a single project plan. It's probably lots of different plans that go together to be a project plan. Handle all the data, the admin, how are you going to keep the team up to date, communication systems, are you going to have meetings with your team, or are you going to just do it all online? How is that going to be controlled? And they're probably going to oversee the budget. They're probably not going to design it, but they will make sure that the spending is kept on track and keep track of logging. And they're probably going to also manage project risk, whether that's strategic project risk, which they'll probably do with the producer, or health and safety risk. And we'll look a little bit at the differences as well. So once all of those questions are answered, and it's really clear the difference between producer finishing the initiation stage and the actual project manager getting ready to start, then we're into planning. So what does that look like? Planning the first stage. So we've talked about who the project team is. So the project manager is going to look at the team in terms of people who have different sorts of roles, like marketing or production and logistics. They're going to make sure those roles and responsibilities are clear. We're then going to go to that point about project stages. What are the stages of the project? You don't want to run all the way through to the end without giving yourself those opportunities to pause and breathe. How are you going to actually control the administration of this project and communicate to people? And then you're ready to create plans. So I'm going to list some of the plans that I think will be in your overarching project plan. There might be some kind of fundraising or income generation plan. I use the word income generation instead of fundraising because not every project relies on fundraising income. Sometimes it might rely on ticket sales or fees. So there might be a plan for how you're going to guarantee that money comes in, because money for projects doesn't always come in at the start. Sometimes it comes in towards the end if you're talking about tickets. So there needs to be a plan for how that's going to come in. You need to make sure that budget is really clear and it's as detailed as possible. How are you going to consult or engage with the community if that's relevant? Depends on the kind of project you're doing. Timeline. You need to be really, really clear on when your timeline are, because that project manager is going to need to be able to control that things are delivered on time. You might have an overarching timeline for the whole project, but you also might have more detailed schedules and timelines for little bits. A marketing plan, something that says how you're going to promote and make sure you bring your audiences in for your project. You might use a marketing specialist to do that. An evaluation framework. I use the word framework because I think it's really about thinking about how the approach to evaluation is going to happen. How are you going to make sure that those objectives that you set at the start have been achieved at the end? So it might be about things like surveys. It might be something more different to that. It might be about how you debrief with the stakeholders to see if they've changed their view. An equalities impact assessment. That's a suggestion. An equalities impact assessment is really just thinking, how are people from different backgrounds going to be affected by your project? How is someone with a particular protected characteristic, perhaps, going to be potentially negatively affected by your project? And is there anything that you can do to create equity in how the project is delivered? Really, it's a mind map of thinking about all the different kinds of backgrounds from people who might be in your audience, and ask yourself, is there something I can do to make it easier for them to access it? That kind of thing is quite helpful as part of your project plan. Environmental impact. Depending on the scale of your project, depends on how you might want to do this, but could you perhaps measure your carbon footprint? Or at the very least, again, do a little mind map and just ask yourself, in what ways might my project negatively impact on the environment? And can I do something to help? A strategic risk assessment. Again, when you're doing activities, you're probably going to want to look at the health and safety or safeguarding risks around that project activity. But overall, there are risks to the whole project if something goes wrong. What happens if you fall ill? What happens if the project manager has to leave the project? What happens if the funder pulls out? They strategically affect the project, and it's worth at least thinking of the key ones and asking yourself, is there anything you can do to mitigate against that being a problem or manage it if it does happen? Archive plan. As I said, all too often we produce beautiful bits of art and we have no idea what we're going to do with them at the end of it. Have a think about that before you get started. That might be relevant to how you do things like artist contracts. Do you need to cover what happens about copyright or paying them to have a license to use their work in 5, 6, 10 years' time? You might need to do that at the beginning, so you need to think about the archive plan at the start. And a debrief process. We remember that we have to learn our lessons at the end of every project. So what's that going to look like? Is it a big team debrief? Are you going to debrief with everybody individually? How are you going to collect that learning? If you're looking at all of those and thinking, blimey, I don't know how to do half of them, I would go back to remember, every one of those is just a plan within a plan, which means you just need to identify what needs to be done, when it needs to be done by, and who's going to do it. Project plans. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because that wouldn't take an hour, that would take a week. What we are going to do, though, is signpost you to a few places where you may be able to find a bit more information. So we've got another webinar specifically on the fundraising, income generation and budgeting side on the 22nd of February. So if you want to know more about that, tune into that one. We've also got a marketing expert coming in to talk to you about marketing on the 13th of June. So again, there's another specialist webinar on that one. And we've got one about equality and diversity and thinking about those things in April as well. So some of those things you can cover at those points. If there's a topic here that you feel nervous about and you want more information about, then please do get in touch with the Producer Hub and ask for more information. We might be able to signpost you to something else that does it. Another thing I would say is things like how to do evaluation or how to write bids. There are other great webinars out there, something like the Centre for Cultural Value, which is based in the kind of Midlands area. They have a whole host of webinars and documents on their website that you can download and read. Locally, there's the Centre for Voluntary Service, the CVS in Bedford, and they also do lots of free webinars and things that you can sign up to that will tell you how to write a good funding bid or how to do theory of change evaluation for projects. So there are other places you can go to get that detail. But I would say if you're looking at that and you're thinking, I feel like I need to do it, but I'm not sure what I need to do, a good place to start is just work out what you think you need to do, when you think you need to do it, and who's going to do it. Just for a few templates and tools, this sort of level of project plan is probably going to be sufficient for something like an Arts Council project grant. Again, it really simply just says, what's the date is that something needs to be done by, what you're going to do and who's going to do it. It doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but it gives you a bit of a sense of the fact that there is an approach, there is a plan. You have thought about the tasks that need to be done and you have set things out in a realistic time frame. That's usually what someone like the Arts Council are looking for when doing a project plan. Unless it's a particularly high-level financial bid, they probably don't need a lot more detail than this. Another way of doing it could be using something like a spreadsheet. This is an example of more like a Gantt chart kind of timeline, where again, you've got a project area, a list of tasks, they're broken down into even more detail, assigned to a team member, and then you can have dates along the side that allow you to just flag where they are. This kind of approach is quite good for getting a sense of where things are happening at the same time, where you might have like a pinch point where there's a lot being delivered together. And if it's all relying on the same person, you'll immediately see where their capacity is overlaid, or whether you need to have something done before another thing can start. And you can line up the colours. It's just another approach. Or you could use software. This is an example of what Asana software looks like. The basic Asana package is free. If you want things like the timeline function that you can see in the middle at the top there, you have to pay for that. But the basic free one is pretty good, and it allows for multiple collaborators. You can all have your own thing and then log in. So if you're a freelancer working with other freelancers or working with other organizations, you can all access the same project plan. And you can see quite easily in this crude example I've put together how you can easily assign the things that need to be done, who's going to do them, and when they're going to be done by, and just keep track of whether that's actually taking place. There are lots of other packages available, Monday, for example. See what works for you, if at all. Risk assessments. This is what you might expect a health and safety type risk assessment framework to look like. Basically, you have levels of likelihood and severity, and you list the kind of hazards, the measures you're going to put in place, you're going to rate them, you're going to think about whether there's anything else you can do, rate them again, and see if you can bring the levels down. This approach works exactly the same way for strategic risks. Strategic risks might look a little bit more like this. Financial risks, for example, what happens if your tickets just don't sell? How does that affect you? How likely is that to happen? How much should you worry about it? Is there anything you can do about it? And again, who is going to be responsible for doing it? Operational risks, perhaps less to do with the health and safety, although you might include the key things in there, but single person dependency is usually a big issue. Reputational risks. What happens if people don't come? What does that do to your reputation? And again, how can you manage that kind of thing? It's a different sort of mind mapping process, but can be quite helpful to make sure you've covered everything you need to do. So, if you've done all of that, you have planned your project, and you're ready to move on to the delivery stages. Use the word stages, plural, because again, I would recommend that you break it into stages and you don't just run from one to another to another. The other thing is, in the same way that you've done a big plan for the whole project at the start, you might want to plan detail of each stage of the project as you go along. You probably don't need to go into huge amounts of detail for installing an exhibition when you haven't actually workshopped it with the community that are creating it yet. So you might want to be planning as you go along by doing it in those stages. Examples of project stages. So let's take a very simple example. Maybe it's going to be an exhibition or visual artworks co-created with the community. So you might have 7 stages. You might say the first stage is just setting up everything with the team, contacting the artists, making sure the team are on board, making sure you've booked the venue, making sure everybody knows what they're doing, making sure written partnership agreements are in place. Then you might have a community workshop stage. Again, what comes out of that might influence that final outcome. So you might not want to plan the exhibition in too much detail until you've done those workshops. So you'll focus on planning and executing the workshops as a first stage. And then you're going to pause and breathe before you go on to exhibition design. Then you might do the design stage separate from the installation stage. Perhaps there's going to be activity during the workshop run. Then you're going to take it down. And then don't forget, just because the project is finished, in terms of the output, there's still another stage to go, which is the debrief and evaluation stage. So really, you're doing that thing on a cycle. You're planning a stage in detail, and you're delegating those tasks. Again, you might have to do a lot of them yourself if you are the project manager, but try and delegate what you can. Then you're making sure it's all been done. And then you're going to breathe, pause, decide whether you're happy to just move on to the next stage or whether maybe you need to make adaptations. Do you need to start looking at the budget again? Is it going well? Have you overspent? Are you in control? Is the artistic outcome what you thought it was going to be? Is everything still okay to move on to the next stage? And then you plan the next stage in detail. If you keep working around that cycle, then you'll find you've got lots of opportunity to keep pulling it on track as you go. Delegating. Assuming you have the luxury of working with other people and not having to do everything yourself. If you can delegate well, you should be able to do it confidently and then step away and just focus on the tasks that you give yourself. So how do you delegate well? Well, you need to explain really clearly what needs to be produced. What is it that you're delegating? What is the task? What are you asking them to do? If you are delegating a budget, be really clear with how much they've got to spend. Is there a deadline? How much effort is required? I mean, that might sound a bit weird, but if you're cutting out leaf shapes, is it okay if they're just roughly leaf shapes, or do they all need to be exactly the same size? Being really, really specific about what you mean about the detail of how much effort is required and the quality standard is going to be really clear as well. Is there any flexibility on those things? This is what Prince 2 would call tolerances. So you might say, I'm going to give you £500 budget. If you really needed another 50 quid, that might be possible, but talk to me first. That's a tolerance. So what you're saying is the budget's 50 quid, but there's a bit of movement up to 50 quid. You might also say, don't underspend it because I don't want to give the money back to the funder at the end of it. Make sure that £500 goes out the door. That's another tolerance. There is no tolerance in the other direction. Be really, really clear about that. Are there any controls and checkpoints required? If you're asking a graphic designer to produce a piece of print, do you want them to check anything with you before they pass it over to the printer? How many times do you want them to do that? What's the process? Making sure there's clear controls and checkpoints means that you don't have to keep asking questions and keep checking in, micromanaging and leaning over the shoulder. You've been really clear at the start what's expected of checking in. Then what's the escalation procedure for problems? Do you want a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, or is an email okay? Do you want them to leave it for 3 days, or do you need to know straight away? Just make sure you're really clear about that. And what's the method of handing over the task once it's been completed? If you've delegated something to someone and they finished it, how do they give it back to you so you can sign it off? And how do you keep up to date? If you can do all of that, I know it seems like quite a lot for potentially a small thing, but normally if you're really, really clear about all of those things, you really should be able to just step away and let them get on with it. Project management is affected by all of these things. You cannot touch one of these without it affecting the other two. I always encourage people to think really, really hard when they're designing their project about how these things are interrelated. Time, money, and quality. If you suddenly find yourself with less time to do a project, the quality might go down. Or you can maybe increase the amount of money and then maybe the quality will stay the same. The same thing could happen. If you increase the money and the time, the quality might go up. If you have less money, the quality is probably going to go down, or it might take longer. Either way, these things are absolutely interrelated. So if you're going to fiddle with any of them at any point in the project, you need to be aware that they're going to affect the other two. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem, providing you can afford to make those changes. But I always say, if you suddenly find you're squeezing the budget, be really, really aware that you're going to have to revisit your schedule and your quality standards at the same time and think about how they've been affected by that change. So we talked a bit about how you plan it. We talked about making sure you have these stages where you're constantly delegating and monitoring that the things have been done using whatever process you're using. And now you're going to close it down. Close down. What do you need to do at this point? You need to reconcile your budget. This is why it's so important that you keep track of your budget as you go along. If you're working with a funder, they might want to see your budget or to have you report back to them exactly how it was spent. Also, you're going to make sure that you haven't, for tax purposes or anything like that, got any money left over or anything that's restricted that wasn't used for the right purpose. So you want to do a thorough reconciliation. I really encourage you to hold really good face-to-face debriefs with everybody who's been involved. It's often overlooked as part of the evaluation process. We tend to focus on surveys of our audiences and forget about everyone else who was involved. But sitting down with those people and saying, how was the process for you? What was good? What wasn't so good? What did you learn? What would you like to feed back? That's where you get those lovely lessons learned. Another thing you can do is keep like a lessons log as you go along and maybe note down problems as they occur. And you might revisit that in your team debriefs and say, what were those lessons? What did we learn? Make sure you record them so that you can read them again when you start the next project. Analyze evaluation data. So if you have done surveys, if you have collected information about who came, who engaged, and how they engaged, that's when you're going to sit down and really analyze it and work out what it's telling you. And then you can use that to report to your funders and stakeholders. You might do multiple different reports depending on who's involved with the project. How you feed back to a partner might be very different to how you feed back to a funder who might have different expectations. And then archive everything. Archive the artistic outputs if that's relevant, and archive your marketing information so you can go back to it. But really think about where you're going to store everything so you can come back to it, because it's so important that you can review it before you do your next project. So that's the presentation. It wasn't too long. Hopefully it was useful to you. And I'm now very happy to take any questions at all. Just remember that if you're asking a question and you put your camera back on, you will see. You can put questions in the chat or put your hand up and Georgia will let you know. I hope it's helpful.
I'll ask a question.
Hello, Talia.
Thank you. That was really very clear, actually. It's good to be reminded of all these things, especially when a project has finished like mine over the summer, and I've realised it's kind of brought home my evaluation stages to do still. So thank you for that. Do you have a quick question? You mentioned that the Centre for Cultural Value, is that right?
Yes.
They had some good resources. Is that what it's called? And is that what their website is, please?
Yes, I think it's come out of Leeds University.
Okay.
So if you search for the Centre of Cultural Value, I'm trying to think of the name of the man who founded it and it's not coming to me. They do a fantastic email bulletin that's worth signing up for, but if you see it affiliated with Leeds University or Google Leeds University as well, you should be able to find it. If not, then message me and I'll make sure we send a link out to it. But they've just sent around, I think just this week, quite an interesting evaluation tool that they've been talking about, which just brings together these sorts of thoughts about how best to do it. There's so many different ways. There's theory of change models, there's this, there's that. You know, they're constantly churning out different things. It's worth looking at some of their seminars as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Any other questions? We've got a minute or two. Oh, fantastic. George has found the link and she's put it in the chat for you.
I can't take credit for it. It was Ali, so thank you for that. All sent, sorted.
Fantastic. No other questions?
I have a question. Hi.
Hi, Mary.
Yes. So my question is, I was trying to just work out how to word it. So if you're doing a process-based project, can all these planning questions come under the research and development stage where you will find those things out as the project goes along? Can that be a realistic thing?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think that would be quite a good idea. I mean, you might find you ask one of those questions and then think it's not relevant at the research process stage, and then it's okay to leave it. But I think it's certainly worth using those as prompts when you're doing that R&D phase and still planning at least some of it if you can.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Sam.
This sounds like a really dark question. I've never used a project manager before, but I'm currently working alongside one, and so it's made me think about like my own practice. And Marianne's question on a research and development has also made me think, would you, if you have like an overarching narrative for a project that may include like a research and development and then a full stage of that, which is a development of that, would you class that as like one project timeline and have a project manager across potentially both, or would you advise like them as individual projects, if that makes sense? Because technically I guess they're the same project if you've just got like a research stage for one and then the main kind of outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it obviously either way, I would argue. I think it probably depends on the resource you've got available. Have you got the ability to have more people on the R&D stage, or is that maybe just you at that point and then you can bring in a project manager later? We've done it both ways. We've sometimes done it where we've treated the R&D stage as a project in itself, and sometimes that's just quite helpful for practically evaluating. So instead of sort of adding money to a budget later and things like that, you just go, do you know what, I'm just going to do a budget for the R&D, spend it, close it down, and then start a new budget for the next stage, almost like it's a new project, even if technically they're the same thing. An example of that, I think, would be our big airship project, where we did like a library R&D project and, you know, just completely evaluated that and controlled all of it separately from the big Airship Dreams thing. But then when we did Airship Dreams, we did treat that as one project, even though it ended up being 2 years and it was projects within projects within projects. We treated them more like stages, but we could only afford a project manager for the latter. So the other one was much more contained. Yeah, doesn't matter. Maybe map out both in your head and decide which one you think makes most sense.
Yeah, cool.
We have a question in the chat. 1 second. When will we be looking at community engagement planning?
I think you should ask yourself that in the initiation stage. And it depends on the kind of project you're doing. I would argue that if the community is sort of essential, if you're doing, like, say, a co-creative process as opposed to just a participatory process, then you need to start at the very beginning and thinking about how you're going to speak to them at the very least about how they might like to be involved.
Sorry to interrupt. I think they meant like, as in like, is there a session where it's going to be discussed about community engagement planning, or?
So I think within the cohort, we will find time to do it within some of the cohort sessions, but we haven't got a webinar or anything specifically dedicated to it. So I would recommend you raise it in one of the cohort sessions and we have a chat about that in some detail there. And if we decide that people would like to go into it in more detail, then we can definitely put something like a webinar together specifically for that.
Cool, thank you for answering that.
Oscar?
Yes, I've got a question which is probably just a bit rogue, but say your project does too well and you have too much money. I know you mentioned in the delivery process that you, for tax reasons and other purposes, you have to somehow put that into the perspective. What are some of the things that you could do without making it sound shady?
This is where I think it's really helpful to really articulate what the project is trying to achieve rather than the different outputs. So, for example, if you go for a funder for some, say, £10,000, and what you say you're going to do with that £10,000 is you're going to work with, you know, this community to create, you know, visual artworks, but you don't specify what they are, then you could say that actually, even if the bulk of the project only used £9,000 and you had £1,000 left, then as long as you continue to deliver it against that objective, they probably won't mind if those are additional to the things that you said originally you were going to spend the money on. If, however, what you say is, I'm asking money for this one play and these 3 workshops, and you're very, very specific and you don't talk about an overarching objective, then it's going to be much harder to justify how they cost more money. Another thing you could do, I suppose, is be brutally honest about whether you think you have all sufficiently charged for your time. And I think one thing that all freelance practitioners are quite bad at doing is actually paying themselves for the actual time they've spent on it. If your rate really is £250 a day and you know you've spent 6 days more on that project than maybe you had planned in the original project budget, or maybe that you had previously taken out of the budget, I don't see why it's not fair to then claim that money back for yourself and say, no, I did actually spend those 6 days working on this project, so I will pay the money to myself. And I think, again, it's legitimate. Does that help?
Yes, yeah, it does. Just because I'm thinking through a lens of a play, and say you budget for 60% of the tickets sold, and you sell, say, 75 because you had a good run. And obviously that's not that big of a, if it's a small play, it's not that big of an amount anyway, so that can probably be justified. But in terms of, say you were doing a massive run, like a month or two, could you possibly justify that as growing the theatre company further, or anything like that?
Yeah, potentially. And I think, again, depends on the funder. Someone like the Arts Council would probably say that comes under the remit of the sort of context that you were going to apply for in the first place. But that's why I would say be a little bit careful about how you word what it is you're funding. So if there's an objective in there that's to do with, like I said, developing a relationship with a particular, group of players or something, then actually investing a bit further in them is not going to be seen as something that's not what the grant was awarded for, if you see what I mean. So it's maybe about just being not too specific at the beginning about some of those outcomes. So as long as you're saying it's the same project outcomes, even if it's not the same tangible things, most funders aren't going to mind. And also a lot of them are quite vague. They might just say how much you spend on artist fees and materials. They're not going to question how much of that was done in delivering which bits. So maybe the thing is just to get someone to invoice it for you so it goes out the bank, even if that time is then spent blending a little bit into the next phase.
Of course. Thank you.
Sam?
This is kind of a really weird add-on for Oscar, but like we had that exact situation when we got our first Arts Council grant, and I didn't realise that Arts Council wanted you to spend all the money. So I was very honest and said, we've come in under budget. And they turned around and just said, I'm sure you can go away and find an expense which will benefit the project overall, even if it's a developmental thing that you can justify as part of the project. So as long as you can find an expense that justifies that is justified, not like obviously go out and buy new equipment that's irrelevant or something like that. They were absolutely fine with that and kind of encouraged the spending of all the money, because the money was there for the project, and as long as it could benefit the project, they were happy with us to do that.
Yeah, I would agree with Sam. I think the Arts Council are a very good funder about that sort of thing. They're quite reasonable. Someone like maybe National Lottery Heritage Fund, maybe slightly less so. They tend to be slightly more specific about what you're doing. But the other thing is that they're also open to change processes. So you could be really brutally honest, like Sam was overly honest, and just say, can I have a chat with you about this? And they will normally say, well, just tell us what you're going to spend it on, and then that's fine. We'll make a note. It's especially okay if there's not a large amount left over. Good position to be in. Any other questions? No, I think we're at the end. Well, in that case, thank you so much, all of you, for your time, and thank you for your questions. It was good to have a chat. As Georgia says, we will put this recording on our website and send it around to you, and I'll make sure you get a PDF of the slides as well. My email address is on there, so if you have any questions, let me know. Happily answer them separately. But otherwise, it's been really good to see you all, and thanks ever so much for joining us for this first webinar.
I'm just going to stop the recording now. Thanks, everyone.
All right, everyone, thanks very much.